we were to sum up the last episode, you could do a lot worse than simply saying strategy is the way a smaller, weaker, less well-funded force defeats a larger, stronger, better funded force. Simple as that. But what does that mean to HR, talent acquisition, recruiting, hiring? We're not laying siege to entrenched forces. We're not bringing elephants over the Alps to defeat an enemy. We're simply trying to convince people that they should apply, that they should accept our offers, that they should see working here as a positive. Hiring has evolved into a stack of tactics, much to its own detriment. We've optimized ourselves into something of a cul-de-sac where every new tool, every new headcount never seems to actually deliver on the promise. So on this, the second episode of the Brand Plan, Marcus and I try to connect the dots between strategic thinking and modern hiring.
You're listening to The Brand Plan, the podcast about the intersection of talent, brand, and strategy, with your hosts Marcus Body of 33 and James Ellis of Employer Brand Labs.
You're here with Marcus and James, and last time we talked about strategy as a concept, sometimes in a military fashion, sometimes in a business fashion. But I think we were only tangentially talking about talent strategy, which is kind of the purpose of the whole Megillah here, the whole process here. So Marcus, I want to hear your thoughts about where either the differentiation between strategy and talent strategy, or how one connects to the other, or how one grows from another. Because I think we've done a good job of defining what strategy is, but not a great job of what talent strategy is.
Absolutely. And I guess, the annoying answer is that in every business, it's going to have a slightly different meaning, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been calling it talent strategy. We'd have been calling it an HR strategy or a people plan. And it's genuinely one of the first things you have to work out is, what does this mean in my organization, and what's the language that we use as a business? But I guess where I'd go is, as a business, you're going to try and make some money or do a thing, and there's a role that people are going to play within that. That's your talent strategy, is the plan of how are we going to get all the people that we need, get them the right skills that we need them to have, and keep them happy while they're doing it. That's your talent strategy. And it could involve bits of learning and development. It's definitely going to involve recruitment. It's going to involve, how you're going to manage those people. It's going to involve how you're going to performance manage and reward those people. But it's how are we going to get the best out of our human resources, to use that much hated old phrase.
Yeah, I feel like there should be like a buzzer somewhere I'm going to play. Either one of us says human resources in a if we say it in a real kind of like sarcastic tone of voice, I'm fine with that. But I think if we use it as a term, it's complicated. So that's a big thing. I was waiting for us to go from strategy to talent strategy and feel like, talent strategy is much more manageable. And you just blew it out of the water. You're talking about human resources as a function, which means learning and development, salary, how you're titling, recruiting and hiring, which of course is where we tend to live. It is, what am I missing?
Reward, I guess there's also, in the modern world, this is also getting into, the bits of strategy around what are we going to have done by humans and what are we going to have done by AI, right? This is now part of the talent strategy is, what of this should be done by a human and what are the pros and cons of doing that versus throwing it to the AI black box that we're all getting very, very excited about. It might well be cheaper, but it might involve some new dangers, This is what I would call the realm of talent strategy. And people have been arguing about this for like over 100 years. It's like Frederick Winslow Taylor, the man for whom we can blame management consultancy, right? He was the one who said, I can get machines running beautifully. Why can't people run as efficiently? And then, that's where management consulting comes from, and that whole kind of scientific management of, can we get people to do things more effectively, and who should we have doing what, and what should we call them, and where should we put them, and should we have aircon in the office? And, all of those kinds of things came along as ideas about how you get more out of people. And now it's even more complicated because all those people are working remotely. I'm in my living room in London. My employers don't have control over this. I do. And that becomes another level of complexity again.
Yeah, Taylorism is effectively the father of the Industrial Revolution. There's things going on, but the second he started measuring it, everybody went, a benchmark, and that's when it all fell to pieces. It's when all or fell into place, depending on how you look at it. So getting to talent strategy. I'm putting asterisks, and to those of you listening, clearly we've scripted this. I want to add internal mobility, because I think that's the forgotten question. Because when it comes to talent strategy, I think of it in terms of how are you arraying your talent style resources, and the word style is important because, to your point, it might be the machine, it might be the AI, it might be a contractor, it might be a gig worker, it might be a full-time employee, it might be an intern, might be all of the above. It could be all those things. But how are you arraying your talent style resources to maximize what your company is trying to do? And while we focus a great deal on the how do we get more side of things, it's also how do you make sure that the ones you're getting in are adding value? I mean, you're looking at massive tech companies who seem to have spent the last 5 years just collecting talent for the sheer sake of either collecting it or to make sure the other guy didn't get it. And now, well, gosh, they're all, they don't have jobs. They're all been laid off, right? They've all been let go because they weren't actually adding value.
Absolutely. And this is where the war for talent, to use a much hated phrase, it gets a bit nefarious. It's, people are literally kind of hoarding talent so that other people can't have them. That's definitely a thing in niche skill areas in IT, that there are a lot of companies have been hogging staff without really knowing why they're doing it, just because if we don't, someone else will, and perhaps we ought to have them. And the people who did that early on with AI are now feeling very, very smug. Whereas, people who hired enormous amounts of people for their massive move into the metaverse are perhaps reconsidering whether that was really worth the investment, And
not to name a name, not to point out fingers. And yesterday, Google announced its big show, and it was AI, all parts, all the time. It's coming from a place where they hadn't done very much of it at all. So in terms of talent strategy, I think of it in terms of how do we array the talent that we have and the talent we can bring in to maximize our resources. And I think it's a complicated question, if for no other reason than there's a lot of evidence to say there are big tech companies who've spent the last 5 years collecting talent that they didn't have immediate need for, right? They said, better to have that person than to not, or a little more cynically, I'm going to have them so that other company that I hate can't have them. And that's why we're in a place where when things get a little tighter, you start to see a huge release of talent back into the world.
Absolutely. These are the organizations that have taken, the nefarious tactics in the war for talent, and they've decided, right, I'm going to hoard this simply so that you can't have that person in niche skill areas or things that you think are going to be the next tech big thing. That's maybe a smart thing to do. So a lot of people will be feeling pretty smug about, I've managed to sort of hire and hoard all this AI talent, as we've all now suddenly got very excited about the possibilities. But then, of course, you have to hang on to these people once you've hired them. You can't just kind of hire them and have them sat there doing nothing. They will leave. They will go to someone else. So you've got to kind of think of, what do we do to kind of keep this talent busy until we really need them for that next thing that we're actually going to do with them? Or do we set them running on you do sometimes get clients who create busy work to kind of keep someone busy doing something until they've got the thing that they really needed them to do. I know a lot of engineering firms do this. So, you've got, Skunkworks at Lockheed Martin is kind of a way of keeping some extremely clever engineers busy until you've got the actual kind of crucial business critical thing you needed them to do. Is, well, let's just give them a large budget and a load of freedom and see what happens. And then, they invented the stealth bomber. That's a side effect of letting them do that. But it's a good way of warehousing talent that you're not quite sure what you need it for yet.
Though albeit an expensive way to warehouse talent. Like, hey, you want to make a stealth bomber? They're pretty cheap, right?
Yeah, I think they ended up making a profit out of that. So, it can work, but it's not an easy tactic. I think there's an interesting thing when it comes to kind of early talent, is that early talent, you're kind of very often you are buying talent futures. You're hiring someone very often in like an October, November, you're not actually going to use until the following year. So you're not really actually using them until next September. I was sort of saying during COVID and during kind of economic downturns, it can be quite smart to, use the graduate talent route as a way to kind of go, well, we're going to need some people when this picks back up. By the time these graduates actually start, things will probably have picked back up. Okay, let's increase the graduate scheme, because they're the only people you can hire now who don't start for a year. That doesn't really happen anywhere else. So, you can get into some kind of quite clever stuff you can do there about how are we going to handle the fact the economy is changing. We don't know what's going to happen next.
So hold on. So it's really interesting, and I like the idea of bringing the early talent question in, but it does make me think. We've described what talent strategy is, but I wonder, do you think most companies can point to their talent strategy? Can they define their strategy? Is there like a pithy phrase? Is it a paragraph somewhere in a book, that they can go, yep, this is our talent strategy? Or is it simply a perspective or an approach to inform the day-to-day decision-making as you go?
I think there are some businesses where you can very definitely point at a talent strategy. So if you look at the typical accountancy firms, law firms, management consultancy, the big professional services firms, they have a talent strategy, which is we're going to hire loads of great young talent and they will gradually leave us and go elsewhere until they...
That is the nicest way to put them in a dog pit, let them fight it out for hours, and only a handful are left and they get the bone.
But it's kind of that pyramid is there and has been there for a very long time, and it kind of works. Now, actually, that pyramid is changing, though, because an awful lot of the work that was done at the bottom is exactly where an awful lot of automation is happening, for example, within accountancy or within law. So suddenly that pyramid is narrowing. And they're now having to rethink what they do with this time, because that bear pit, that dog pit, however we describe it, you need more of them to actually make it through now. Because the bottom of the pyramid is narrower, you actually need to care more about retention than you ever did when you were hiring huge numbers of people. And you were fine with 95% of them leaving you.
And you could take risks of who you picked, because it was okay if they didn't pan out because you had plenty. Now that the base of the pyramid is narrower, you're making the choice earlier, and you can't take the same kind of risks.
Exactly. And suddenly you're trying to choose someone and go, who'll be a good partner in 20 years' time, not who'll be very good at the job right now that we need them to do next year. And that completely changes how you need to go about finding those people, choosing them, but also once you've got them in, how are you going to mentor them? How are you going to look after them? How are you going to make sure they don't leave you as soon as they've got their qualification after 3 years, 5 years? They can go. How are you actually going to hang on to them to the point where you really need them now? And it completely changes that strategy. And then likewise, very obviously there are also other businesses you can point at and go, they've got a talent strategy that is based on a contingent workforce. They're taking people on who they are expecting to turn over. That's their plan. And therefore they're not going to invest a lot of money in training and development, because there's no point. These people don't stay with us very long. We just need to get them to competent and then let them go. So that then becomes a kind of, a very different talent strategy. And you kind of go, okay, we know we're going to have this high churn. We know we're going to need to recruit at high volumes. We know we need to get really efficient at doing that, efficient at onboarding people, but also not take it too personally when they do quit. That is our plan. That's okay.
Yeah. And there's a whole other, take it to the flip side, is that, there are talent strategies around, we're only going to hire the best, like these premium, pay at a super high cost. That's a different talent strategy than, say, an enterprise rent-a-car or enterprise, holdings, which says we hire everybody at the very base level, and everybody up into, including sometimes the CEO, started there and worked their way up. That is our talent strategy.
The classic example of that in most countries is the military. So the military typically have an attitude of, we will hire people in and then equip them up to be, the most senior general you have started at the very bottom, or almost at the very bottom.
Wait, are you saying the general didn't come from PricewaterhouseCoopers? You get KPMG? That what? No.
But it's kind of a fascinating thing. I didn't realise this until someone pointed out to me a while ago, and they said, do you know what the oldest management school in the world is? And I guessed, is it London Business School? And they said, no, it's Sandhurst, and then it's West Point. And, it's the military officer schools are the oldest management schools in the world, because they've always had this attitude of, we must create our own leaders from the bottom, and you need to know this thing. Not quite from the bottom, but from junior officer, and it's a very, very different talent attitude to, what you often get in the world of commerce, which is, oh no, we can go and hire that talent. We can get a headhunter to go and get us. That's frowned upon in military circles these days. Although, of course, it wasn't in history,
No, you hired the king's son, and they were, oh, well, he's the king, so I guess he's the, not the corporal, but not quite the general, but certainly very high. The royals were, in fact, the generals and leaders.
But in the Napoleonic era, you had, French officers in the Russian army and German officers in the English army. It was not uncommon for people to kind of literally change army. That's frowned upon these days, I think, largely. But, it's a kind of, they are a fascinating world of talent to look at, because they've been thinking about this for longer than most businesses have existed. Militaries have been trying to do this and figure out, how do you grow talent? How do you take someone and turn them into a capable leader? And how do you turn them into a technical expert? So they're kind of really interesting from a talent strategy point of view.
This year, one agency won more RAD awards for recruitment marketing, branding, and communications than any other, with work that has transformed the employer brand of some of the world's biggest companies. That agency might be a name you don't recognize yet. Stay tuned to learn more.
Yeah. So we have pyramid model, hire lots of people very, very, very early on, let them kind of figure their way up. You have hire at the top, and that's what you need. You want the best talent. Are there any other broad, maybe in the parlance, grand strategies that we could be touching on about talent strategy that aren't those two things?
I think there is the talent strategy that is it's like the challenger brand. So you know how in any consumer sector you have the challenger brand that comes to say, hey, we're different. You know, you've been buying whatever beverage for years, but we do the same thing but in a different way, and that's why you should buy it. There's an awful lot of challenger brands in the world of talent, which are, you know, hey, you know, you work in a recruitment advertising agency. We're a new recruitment advertising agency that does things differently. Come and work for us because we're going to do things in a different way. And it exists in opposition to whatever the main employers are in that sector. So loads of tech startups kind of exist in this kind of space. And they say, come and work with us because you're fed up of working for big tech, you know, and therefore everything about their employment offer is predicated on the things that people don't like in big tech. Now, of course, they can't offer you all the good things that people like in big tech. They don't have the resources. So they have to take that strategy of, we're going to offer a completely different type of career path. We're going to offer a completely different type of career proposition. And the ones who do this really well think about that incredibly consciously, you know, and they go, right, what is the opposite training and development strategy to the big guys? Because we can't beat them at their game. Let's do a completely different one. And, you know, and if you do that well, you construct a completely different type of employment. And you say to people, you know, if you want the big company offer, stay there. But if you want something different, we've got this thing over here, come to us. And that can be quite a successful strategy.
Yeah. I think we should probably do a whole episode on just, I mean, I suspect you're about as interested in challenger brands as I am. I'm obsessed with them. And my kind of like pet theory at the moment is that I don't understand why every employer brand talent strategist is not thinking of challenger brands, because challenger brand says we are not the big guys, not to be completely sexist there, but you understand what I'm saying. We're not the big company, and we're not the 800-pound gorilla in this market. Therefore, we have to do something different. But if you look at company structures, there is no 800-pound gorilla in the talent world, right? They're big players, but do they hire 20% of the market? No. I mean, even the governments do not hire that many people. So every company is, in a way, a challenger brand, and we should be taking a lot of lessons from it. But again, that's my pet theory.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, who has the position of strength is a fascinating one in employer branding in particular, because, you know, if you think about early talent, who they've heard of is very, very different. So, you know, young people haven't heard of EY and Deloitte and PwC when they arrive at university, unless they've got a relative work there. By the time they've left, they definitely have, but they haven't heard of them when they start. So they start off from a position of weakness versus, you know, a big consumer brand like a Coca-Cola or something like that, which we've all definitely heard of. Fine, you know, so they start out with the advantage, but that changes completely once you get into kind of the experienced hire sort of market, when it then becomes about, you know, for lawyers, okay, so I'm going to have heard of the big law firms. I'm going to have heard of some of the other places where I could go and work as being a lawyer, but there are plenty of, you know, perfectly good companies I could go and work at that I've never heard of because they're not a law firm, but they still need a lawyer. But you're on the back foot when you work with me, even if you are the biggest thing in packaging, because I'm a lawyer. And it can change. For the same company can be a challenger in one type of talent and a, you know, big established leader in a different type of talent. And that's very often what some of them really struggle with is moving modes from, okay, we're not the big boys in this particular type of talent because we're not obvious. Whereas in this type of talent, we've been doing some fascinating work with KFC hiring tech talent. Now, we've all heard of KFC, but you don't necessarily think of them as a tech. They're a huge tech employer, but they don't necessarily spring to mind if you're a tech person. Even if you're going to lunch there every day, you don't necessarily think of them. So actually there, you have to be a challenger brand because you're not the obvious choice.
Yeah, and they're one of the kinds of companies that are immediately going to jump into AI to take orders on drive-thrus and apps and stuff like that. So it is the AI thing. Aside from the obvious, wow, it's going to change how we work. It's going to absolutely change the landscape on which we think about what a job is and what do we get out of a job and all that good stuff.
I was talking to a client about 5 or 6 years ago, and they said, "What do you think is the future that HR people should be thinking about?" And I think some of my predictions were right and some of them were wrong. One of the ones I still stand by, I said to them at the time, there is going to be debates within companies about what do we want to have done by humans and what do we want to have done by an AI. And frankly, that should be an arm wrestle between the CPO and the CTO, or whatever those people are called in your company. There should be, and almost the role of that chief people officer might be to lobby for why having this done by people is a good idea, objectively and philosophically and legally, and for all these different reasons. In opposition to the CTO, who is definitely going to be gunning for, here is a piece of software that can come and do this thing for us. Who's going to make the opposite case? Well, it should be the people division, the human resources division, the person, whatever they're called within your organization. They surely should be the ones lobbying for, hey, people are a really good answer for this. Let's tell you why. Here's how we're going to get them. Here's how we're going to train them. Here's how we're going to keep them. That's going to be an interesting debate at lots of companies.
And I think it's going to be interesting how one of their very early arguments is going to be, well, when it screws up, you can't fire the AI, but you can blame the person and you get to make it take action on it. And it's not quite scapegoating, but certainly you can't sue an AI, but you can sue a person. And I think that is, until we define from a legal standpoint what an AI is, and that's not a subject for this podcast for either of us, but it is the relative value of a person has a lot of different values more than anything else.
The culpability one is interesting. I was asking colleagues recently saying, what if an AI accidentally uses the pronoun he in a job ad? You've just opened yourself up to gender discrimination claims that would be perfectly legit. But if an AI wrote that, who's responsible? Is it the AI provider? Is it the person who signed up to that? But, I know who's liable for it. You are the employee. Certainly in the UK, you could be taken to an employment tribunal for that kind of thing. And you would probably lose if you bought an AI that did that. So it's going to be there's going to be lots of interesting legal cases. And I know, in the States, it's going to be more complicated. There might be different rules from state to state as to how that actually pans out and who is responsible. And it's going to be an interesting time for the employment lawyers.
More work for lawyers. Yay. That always bodes well for the rest of us.
Indeed.
Let's kind of nudge it back into the lane a bit here. So if talent strategy is how do you think about, attract, collect, leverage, take a value out of the people side of things, where does employer brand fit into that? Is it a tiny little nugget of it? Is it broad? I mean, how do you think about that?
So I think it's going to depend on what your talent strategy is, how important a role the employer brand strategy has to play and what it's doing. I mean, I suppose the definition I quite often use for clients with the word brand, I sort of go, right, what is branding? Whether it's consumer branding, personal branding, employer branding, I always think of it as this really simplistic model of you've got some kind of badge or label that consists of a logo and a look and feel and some colours and a picture style, and you're going to build some associations with it. And that's what you're doing. So building a personal brand is about, people going, that's James Ellis's face. I think he's interesting and cool to listen to. And that's the association you're trying to build over time. And it's the same with an employer brand. You've got, if I see, the your logo and the jobs URL underneath, what immediately pops into my head? That's where I think employer branding is, as opposed to recruitment marketing. So if your talent strategy is to hire huge numbers of people, it's going to be pretty important because we're now talking about what a huge number of people are going to think instantly they see you. Likewise, if your talent strategy involves taking lots of people from your competitors, it's going to be very important. And that's a group with whom you can build a brand over time because you know where they work. So you can kind of target them and kind of keep hitting them. If you are a small employer who's going to hire someone once in a blue moon and actually you're not that bothered about the quality of them or you're going to, actually employer brand might be incredibly trivial as a part of your talent strategy. And, you might still have a document labeled employer brand strategy, but you're probably not going to show it to the CEO because it's not important enough. Whereas, with other businesses, it's like this is a CEO level issue. Is how are we seen as an employer? And that's often a useful question to think through is who's the most senior person in your organisation who would be really interested in that conversation? Is it the head of talent? Is it the head of HR? Is it the chief people officer? Is it the CEO? Is it the whole board? A lot of clients I'm working with at the moment, it's the whole exec committee and the board are interested in that question. I did a global EVP recently for a client, and we even had the non-exec directors were involved in this conversation because they see it as that important to their business plan. Is how are we seen as an employer? Why should people come and choose to work here?
Yeah. So is that purely in terms of getting the right level of interest so that it gets proper buy-in and stakeholders so that when you do build a brand or deliver an EVP or whatever the solution ends up being, you have enough proper leeway to say, look, leadership wants it, so it's got to be a thing? Or where do you see, if you're bringing in a whole board and the entire C-suite, entire executive team, are they shaping what the brand is? Can an executive team shape what the brand is?
Absolutely. So back to your point earlier about, say, internal mobility, right? That's a board level issue. Is are we going to let people move from country to country? Are we going to encourage people to move from country to country and different division to different division? That's a board level question. That's something that the people who run your company have to decide is, are we going to keep people where they are and maximise how valuable they are there? Or do we see a long-term benefit in people having experienced different parts of our business? And, that is a decision that can be taken in the boardroom. Once that decision's been taken, oh my word, you've then got a lot of work to do to put in place all the systems that allow you to do that. This is very often when companies go, we better go and implement a big HR system that pans across all of our entities that therefore allows someone to move from the US to Germany, because at the moment they're on completely different HR systems, and that would be logistically incredibly difficult. It can then dictate all sorts of work that has to be done by different specialist teams, and teams in L&D, teams in HR, but also you need all these individual line managers to have an attitude change, and you need to start rewarding managers who let members of their team go, which obviously is quite a painful thing to do. If I've got a brilliant member of staff, to go, oh yeah, fine, you can leave us.
Meet 33. Known for creating and elevating some of the world's most valuable employer brands here in the US and across the pond in Europe, 33 understands that everyone has a story to tell. From KFC to BMW, from AWS to KPMG, 33 has been building some of the most creative and influential employer brands around the world. If you want to see how they can tell your company's story, head to their website in our show notes.
Yeah, that's a big ask to let people go, and I know that's probably the biggest sticking point. I have a friend who is very deeply involved in internal mobility questions, and that tends to be where the wheels fall off the cart, as it were. Okay, so I want to get back to this idea of, so you've got a couple of different tracks here, and you've got this idea that leadership needs to own, or at least drive, or it sounds like set the talent strategy, because it has huge costs, it has huge repercussions, it's got to be seen in totality, not in this tiny little sea in the world through a drinking straw sort of situation. But at the same time, the employer brand is informing the collection of, or the attraction level of that talent. So I'm seeing like these, maybe like a pincer movement, right? You've got stuff going on at the top and you've got stuff happening at the middle. How do you put those things together? Because I've got a trick question at the end of this and I want to see where you land.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm kind of worried about the trick question. I guess this is why, whenever I'm working on an employer brand strategy with the clients, like we have to speak to those people very, very early on in the process to understand, firstly, do they think this is important? And it's fine, actually, if they say, no, you go away and you do that thing, that's nothing. Actually, most of our talent strategy is hiring entry-level talent. I don't know anything about that. Go away and do a good job. And that doesn't make them bad people if they have that attitude. They're just saying, this is something that I don't need to involve myself in. I trust the people that this is delegated to. It's fine, and that may be appropriate. But other times, that's where you get into this interesting conversation where they say, look, historically, we've hired people from over here, but in the future, we're going to hire people from over there. We might need to change how we're seen in order to be able to do that. We're certainly going to be using this brand to people who don't know us at all. Wow, okay, that's a pretty profound thing that you need to know very early on. And you need to stay in conversation with those people all the way through that project, because all the expertise in talent acquisition is in an area that isn't now the focus. And you kind of go, right, all this experience over here is kind of useful, but it's not what we're going to be doing in the future. We're going to be over here. So actually, we need to kind of think a little bit bigger and a little bit wider. And we might need to try things that we haven't done before, or even things that we did before that didn't work over here, but that might work over. We might have to revive some things we've tried before.
Yeah.
Because
hold on. So you've got the strategy idea, and then you've got the arraying and aligning of resources to activate that strategy, but the actual work is still getting done all over the map.
Oh, completely, absolutely. I mean, always, I think the easy bit in some respects, in terms of the least number of people involved, is usually in the external recruitment marketing, right? There's normally a relatively small number of people. You can write a list of them who are doing that for your organization, even at a very, very big company. That'll be a long list, but you could write that list. Whereas, like, if you're talking about internal communication of an employer brand, wow, that's now every line manager in your organization. That becomes a vastly more difficult list to write, and certainly not a list of people you could contact and say, hey, please use this employer brand guide. It's not going to happen. You're going to have to think in a different way about how you're going to do this when that's your audience. It's a much more bigger, amorphous group of people.
Yeah. Okay, so and this is the trick question, which of course isn't a trick question because whatever. I think this is more of a cultural approach more than anything else. And I think my feeling has always been that because employer brand as a concept was invented on your side of the world, and it was developed in a certain way, and it was very product marketing, packaged consumer marketing approach to things, there was a focus, almost exclusive focus, on the outside world. And in the US, we still have conversations, and every time I talk about employer branding and how it's great at attracting and engaging talent, there's always someone in the audience who goes, and don't forget retention, and they're 100% correct. It's just that it's not top of mind for me. So, the way you've described employer brand in this shape of things, of talent strategy, it's been the means by collecting and attracting and bringing the people in. But how are you leveraging it to think about mobility, to think about how to sell the overall talent strategy of, hey, we've decided to go, instead of collecting talent from over here, we're going to collect it from over here. Or we're going to focus more on AI, so therefore we only have to hire these types of people instead of all these types of people. Yeah,
I mean, I think the potential for this is almost bigger internally. It's saying to the people you've got, hey, here's why you should stay with us for the next 5 years. And, have you got an answer for that? And especially if you're in that point where your business is changing and, like, we were doing this, but now because we're going to be implementing an AI solution, your job's going to change and it's going to be more about this. It's maybe going to be less technical and more consulting. Okay, we've got to persuade all the people who joined us 5 years ago for this proposition that this is good news, that this is something that's interesting. Or indeed, let them realise, hey, this isn't for me anymore, I want out of here, and doing that in a graceful way. But there's also other audiences I think people often forget. Like, if you're in acquisition mode and you buy a smaller company, okay, I didn't choose to join you, and suddenly I'm on your workforce. You need to tell me really quickly why this is good news. And this is, hugely, the employer brand should be absolutely front and center here when you've acquired a company is, hey, everyone, this is the brilliant thing about the fact that you now work for Globocorp, not mum and pop shop in wherever it is. Actually, we've got better benefits. You can move across the world. You can go work in our UK operation. You need to tell them why this world is better, or they might go. And especially the good ones might go. So there's all sorts of audiences for an employer brand, but it depends on what your talent strategy is. And if you are an organization that is planning a lot of acquisitions, then a lot of your talent strategy is going to be about engaging acquired employees, not hiring people. It's going to be, how do we deal with these lumps of people who arrive at once and feel uncertain? How do we give them a kind of nice thing that then go, oh, this is brilliant. It's not just that, whoever owned us before needed to cash out and go and enjoy the golf course. Yeah, which is probably partly the answer, but you need to tell them why this is good news for them, or the risk is you lose all the good ones and you only keep the ones who are too apathetic to move.
Okay, so let's take a half a step back and kind of layer this together. So you got business strategy. How are we going to make a whole pile of cash so we can all eventually get to this beach you reference, or the golf course, wherever you're sending us? Which either way, hey, be you do you. You've got talent strategy on how you leverage the internal people type resources. See, I didn't say human resources. I don't get the buzzer. And how to leverage that to achieve those goals. And then you've got employer brand, which I'm now wanting to think of in terms of as a messaging positioning strategy to make the talent strategy, one, make sense to everybody. Oh, this is why we're doing this, because we're this kind of company. And two, how do you communicate that out to the world so that what people hear internally is what people hear externally, so they all have a shared sense of, oh, this company is like this and not like that.
Absolutely. No, I think that's the sensible way of thinking about it. But you're always going to need slightly different versions of that, because the story inside, you can use all sorts of jargon and truths that the people inside know about, and you can refer to the Inspire program or the X value set or things that they will recognize because they've heard them, and you go, no, as you probably realized from the launch of our leadership values last year, we're now focused over here. It's tying all of that stuff together. I think there's an interesting thing that sometimes I've done an exercise before with clients where we do a list of all the abstract nouns you are throwing at staff. And if you work at a big organization, you've probably got a set of values. You might have a competency framework. You might have an employer brand. You might have some leadership principles. Yeah, you've got a mission. You've got a vision. And once you start racking those up, you can end up with an awful lot of abstract concepts that you're throwing at staff.
And abstractly related to each other. It's a total spaghetti mess of like, how does this mission inform the values, or wait, does the value inform the mission, and how does that turn into the charter, which leads to it's a mess.
Exactly, and and for the employee that can get a little bit confusing, and if they get confused, they'll just ignore it. They'll ignore all of them except for the one that you tell them is attached to some money, which is quite often whichever one is going to be used in their annual appraisal might be the value set. So that one will win because it's the one that, has got something in it for me. And it's not because they're bad people. It's just because this is all a bit confusing, especially if the people you employ are not people who deal with abstract nouns a lot. If you are a law firm, you can expect people to be able to kind of interpret this stuff more readily than if you're a big manufacturing business where I work all day with ear protectors on and I don't think about abstract nouns.
But I think part of that reason is because law firms tend to be a very homogeneous populations. They're all lawyers. Whereas a hospital, a manufacturing sector, there's a lawyer over there. And they don't work the factory floor. They don't take blood. They don't do the surgery, thank goodness. But you have a very heterogeneous kind of type of population in terms of what they care about, what they're looking for, how they absorb information, what matters to them, their motivation, et cetera, et cetera.
Completely, and when you get into really, really big businesses, if you're a business at the scale of someone like a GE, you might go, actually, genuinely, there are differences between different bits of our business because they are doing some really quite fundamentally different things in very different ways, and it's genuinely a decision that you have to make as a business: is how much are we going to try to be one company, and how much are we not? Well, I think every large business I have ever worked with, certainly every business that operates in more than 4 countries, at some point has an initiative called One Insert Company Name. When you take the franchise global, James, you will have an initiative called One Employer Brand Labs, where, and it happens with a kind of stunning inevitability. And sometimes they're doomed to failure because this organisation just is too varied, and actually there are good reasons why bits of it are behaving quite differently. But as you say, if you are a global law firm or a global accountancy firm, in theory this is more plausible. It becomes more difficult though because of course there's a partnership environment. So actually the leadership of the business is a much more complicated question because that is spread around lots of different places and part shares. So actually, it's very challenging to do even in those environments.
I think we're going to find that this whole podcast is going to be me trying to simplify things, and you're going, hold on a minute, now let me unpack this a bit more, and I'll be like, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, that's good.
In theory, but yeah.
All right, I think that's a great place to stop things. Marcus, I think next time we're going to talk about what's broken. I think that's what we kind of loosely decide on, which is kind of an open field at this point, but super exciting for me.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, it's not that anything is broken beyond repair, but when we were talking through what we might talk about, I think we just thought it would be really good for this podcast to get into things that are knotty and that are difficult and where there isn't a simple solution. And it just allows us to get a little bit more into some of these niches about, if you're going to do this thing, how do you do it slightly more effectively? What are the problems that you can run into? And it allows us to just talk about, some of the solutions that you can find along the way. But hey, it's been an absolute pleasure as always.
As always, and I'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for listening to The Brand Plan. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we'd appreciate it if you'd spread the word.